Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so this is our third video for chapter 5, and in this video we're just going to look solely at intensity or intensive quantity, which is the same thing. We'll also look a little bit at what Deleuze has to say about Bergson on this, which is interesting. But yeah, intensive quantity. We've talked about this in the last video. We first raised the idea of intensive quantity there when we were talking in particular about the pure spatium. And so this was in connection with depth and distance. And this was all, though not extensive. So it's depth, distance, quantity, not understood as in the empirical sense of those words, but as they are related to difference, related to that which grounds the extensive notions of distance and depth and quantity. So anyway, we'll see what we'll see what Deleuze has to say about this in today's video. So we'll start with intensity. Right, so there are three characteristics. I think I mentioned that. The first is that intensity is difference in quantity. Here's the quote. Intensive quantity includes the unequal in itself. It represents difference in quantity. It is therefore the quality which belongs to quantity. It appears less as a species of the genus quantity than as the figure of a fundamental or original moment present in every quantity. Okay, so I mean, this is just kind of extending what we've already talked about with regards to intensive quantity. But I did want to make a couple of observations here. First, intensity as difference. We've talked about this before, the way that intensity is fundamentally difference, so that to say a difference in intensity is a tautology, because intensity is a difference between two levels, two things, two elements, two different whatever they are, whatever it is we're talking about. So fundamentally, it's a difference between those two things. But each element within that intensive difference is also grounded in a relation between two prior elements. So it's grounded in a prior difference. We called that disparity, that infinitely doubled difference as we go back through. So everything's basically grounded in difference. So it makes no sense it doesn't. It's not that it makes no sense. It's just a tautology to say a difference of intensity, because intensity is fundamentally difference. But this idea of quantity is a little bit different. So intensity is quantity. Intensity is a difference in quantity. But it's that quantity which is not an extensive quantity. It's not a quantity in the empirical sense of the word. It's the quantity which grounds that empirical sense of quantity. So it's quantity as it is associated fundamentally with difference, with that pure spatium, with the distance that we can think of between, as existing between two elements, a relation between two elements in the idea, for example. So in that sense, Deleuze says it's less quantity as such, it's less quantity proper. It's not a species of the genus quantity. Rather, it's more like the quality that belongs to every quantity. In other words, it's what every quantity fundamentally is. It fundamentally is this intensity, i.e. it fundamentally is grounded in difference. So an interesting way to think about it, I think, it's rather than thinking of this intensive quantity as belonging to the quantitative, it's more like the quality of every quantity. quite like that way of thinking about this. So I think that's okay. Now, he gives a nice example here too, which also clarifies quite well, I think. He talks about ordinal numbers as opposed to cardinal numbers. So ordinal numbers, things like first, second, third, right, fourth, that kind of ordinal numbers. And these are intensive and vectorial. So they're intensive because they only exist in relation to other ordinal numbers, right? Third, to say third, it only makes sense in relation to first, second, fourth, fifth, sixth, other ordinal numbers. It fundamentally only has a place within this wider context. So there's already an intensity, a relation of intensity implied in ordinal numbers, and they're vectorial because they're aligned along a direction. That there is a fundamental inherent. There's a direction inherent to them, right? First is the first, and we can move down the line. There is this intrinsic direction to them. So there is then in ordinal numbers a difference of quantity which cannot be cancelled. There's a difference in quantity. There's a difference in the relation between different ordinal numbers which you can't eliminate. Because if you eliminate that difference, if you cancel that difference, then what you get is not ordinal numbers anymore, you get cardinal numbers. And cardinal numbers are extensive and scalar. So they're each number is completely separate from other numbers, and there's no implied direction to them, right? They're static, discrete objects, and they have there's no sense of context with any of these numbers. You can kind of give them an artificial sense of context when you put them on a number line, for example, but that's artificial. They are fundamentally what they are: discrete, separate, independent from other numbers. And that's just because they're just like they're indexes, really, right? Indices. Each number is an indice. It doesn't mean anything in relation to other numbers. They each completely stand alone. And so this then is where the difference, which we saw was so fundamental to ordinal numbers, has been cancelled. It's been eliminated, and we're just left with these standalone entities. So in ordinal numbers, there is then an irreducible distance. That word again coming up, not in an extensive sense, but as in, but in that sense of being associated with difference, a distance connected with difference, that pure spatium, not extensive but intensive. An irreducible distance, a distance, Deleuze says, which is implicated in the depth of an intensive spatium. Great little quote, and something that you have to be able to make sense of if the rest of this chapter is going to make any sense to you. So in ordinal numbers, there is a distance which is implicated in the depth of an intensive spatium. Make sure you're comfortable with all of those terms there. Cardinality, of course, also includes a distance between the terms, but there's no intensity, because rather than an intensive relation between them, where they're tightly bound in these, where they each ordinal number is what it is only in relation to other ordinal numbers, there is, with cardinality, there's an extensive equality among the cardinal numbers. There's a relative equivalence of exteriorized terms. And that's what I meant when I said they're independent. They're completely exterior. They're external to one another. There's no intrinsic, inherent relation between any of them that defines what they are. They each stand alone on that number line. And one way maybe to help think about this is if you imagine a number of objects, and if you wanted to count them, for example, it doesn't matter what order you count them. It doesn't matter which one is number one, which one's number two, and so on, because each number is purely, again, almost arbitrary. It's just an index. It has no intrinsic meaning in itself. But if those same objects were treated in an ordinal sense, so if there was some kind of measure by which one could be understood as being first, and the next one second and third and so forth, then you can't mix the order anymore. Right? Then there is ordinality becomes crucial. There's an intrinsic relation built into the ordinality there. And so I think that makes sense to me anyway. It helps me understand this difference between ordinal and cardinal. The other thing that Deleuze says about this is that we don't need to presuppose the identical unity of cardinality for ordination. These are, the ordinal and the cardinal are completely different planes, I've said. And that's a little bit of a Bergsonian way of thinking, but completely different levels. The ordinal and the cardinal, completely, they're differences in kind, not differences in degree, would be another way to say it. So Deleuze goes so far as to say that ordinal number becomes cardinal only by extension, to the extent that the distances enveloped in the spatium are explicated, or developed and equalized in an extensity established by natural number. So ordinal and cardinal are completely different what? They're completely different. They're different in kind. And rather than, which this is what we normally think, the ordinal is like a derivative of the cardinal, Deleuze is saying it's the opposite's the case. Ordinality is first, and then it is what becomes cardinal. It becomes cardinal through extension. When we extend these distances which are enveloped in the spatium, when they're explicated or developed and equalized by natural number into this derivative form. So the original is ordination, which is bound up with intensity and difference, and then the derivative is cardinal, which is an explication or an extension of that fundamental implicated intensity. Nice. So that's the first quality, that's the first characteristic anyway of intensity. The second one is that intensity affirms difference. And in the first place, it affirms difference. This is just because intensity is difference. We've already talked about that. It's difference in itself. It's inequality as such. What intensity is in its essence, if you like, at its very root, at its core, it is difference. That's why, we can think of intensity affirming difference. But Deleuze has something slightly different in mind here, and this is that this inequality or dissymmetry or difference is not the absence of equality or symmetry or difference. In other words, it's not negative. And this is what he's really getting at with the word affirm. Intensity affirms difference. It's not a negation. It's not a negative movement. The negative is the image of intensity seen from below. What from on high is affirmation of difference becomes from below the negation of that which differs. Here again, therefore, the negative appears only with extensity and quality. Now this is a nice quote because it ties us back to something that Deleuze said many videos ago, when he talks about negation as being difference seen from below. And here we've got the exact same thing, except it's instead of difference, now it's the image of intensity seen from below. So that again just reinforces the connection between intensity and difference. But we get more detail here on this below, what the below is. And it's extensity and quality. So that when difference or intensity is seen from below, what does Deleuze mean when he says below? He means seen under or understood in terms of extensity and quality. So, how does negation arise? Difference is inverted, first by the requirements of representation which subordinate it to identity, then by the shadow of problems which give rise to the illusion of the negative, finally by extensity and quality which cover or explicate intensity. It is underneath quality and within extensity that intensity appears upside down, and that its characteristic difference takes the form of the negative, either of limitation or of opposition. And that is a really, that quote just captures the essence of Deleuze's attitude towards negation. So how does negation arise? 3 steps basically. There's that representation, which it's Deleuze's word, which subordinates difference to identity, which brings identity forward and makes that the dominant appearance. Then the shadow of problems. So the problems that we talked about with regards to difference, problems and questions, their shadow creates the illusion of the negative, that there's something missing, there's something lacking, there's a negating force here. And then by extensity and quality, which explicate that intensity, which take that intensity, and this is another word for actualize, right, or differentiate with a C. They turn that difference, that fundamental difference and intensity, into an empirical extensity. And remember that when Deleuze talks about extensity and quality, he's talking about basically primary and secondary qualities. That's the more common philosophical term for them, primary and secondary, or as he also calls them, qualitas and quale. But that's a nice, I think, representation here, or a little way to think about how negation arises. Starting with representation, where we get identity, then the shadow of problems creates the illusion of negativity, and then extensity and quality, which cover over the intensity. And so that all that's left is, all that appears, that remains is the appearance of a negation. And this negative comes in 2 forms, either limitation or opposition. And it isn't that there aren't these things. It's not that these are illusory, but it's more that they aren't originary. Because the originary is the affirmation of difference. It's a positive movement that Deleuze is outlining here. It's not negative. The negative would imply that there's identity prior to whatever. There's identity, that identity is the original state of affairs. And then this difference is a kind of derivative of that. But Deleuze is reversing this. What's original is the difference. That's the thing that is primary. It's the identity, which is the derivative. So this is very Nietzschean, right? This idea of affirming difference. Difference is not something to be eliminated or cancelled. We want to. It's not that we. Well, it's not so much that we want to promote difference. It's more that difference is a positive movement. It's not something. It's not derivative, and it's not something we want to avoid or eliminate. And in that sense, it's very Nietzschean, very kind of loving the conflict, loving the struggle. It kind of has those kinds of tones, those kinds of overtones, right? Okay, the third quality is that intensity is an implicated and enveloped quantity. So there's a little bit to get through with this idea. There's this more terminology, right? More words, more terms to just wrap your head around. But again, like I said in the last video, these different ways of describing essentially the same thing shed light on different aspects of it, which just contributes to a more fuller understanding, I think. So originally I was maybe like you might be now, just thinking, what's up with all of these bizarre words that are not being used in a conventional sense. But now I'm kind of appreciating the value to doing this, because now that I've gone through it in this kind of detail, I feel like I have a much fuller grasp of intensity and difference as a result of it. So anyway, intensity is an implicated and enveloped quantity. The line that I'm going to analyze this through is where Deleuze says that within intensity, difference is that which is implicated and enveloping, and distance is that which is implicated or enveloped. So both of these, difference and distance, so we're within intensity, right? Both of these ideas, difference and distance, are implicated because they are pre-explication, if you like. They're not explicated. They're on this, the fundamental, the metaphysical, the transcendental side of the picture. This is prior to actualization. But these two implications come in different orders, Deleuze says. So the first one is a primary order, and this is the implication of difference, and it's a state in which intensity is implicated in itself. So intensity is, and this is just the idea that it's implicated, it's prior to, it's hidden, if you like, it's covered over when the idea is actualized, but the implication is within itself. It's not let me just leave it at that. It's within itself. I think this will make sense when we contrast it with the secondary order. But, and this is kind of a little point of confusion to add, Deleuze also says that intensity is implicating. So it's implicated in this first order sense. It's implicated in itself. But it's also implicating, and I take this to mean that it's active in a sense. It's the driving force behind what eventually will be the empirical concrete reality. The secondary order of this implication is distance. And distance is a state in which intensities are implicated, but with a view to being explicated. It's kind of like maybe it's not, I think it's a good way to understand it, but it's not an exact kind of description of this, but it's almost like a stepping stone. It's a way to understand the relation between elements within an idea prior to them being actualized in a concrete reality, prior to them being explicated. So distance is intensities are implicated in distance because they are partially on the way to being explicated in extensity. And those are the two different orders of implication. So both difference and distance are implicated, but within intensity, but in different ways, in those different, corresponding to those different orders. And now the enveloping distinction. So difference is enveloping and distance is that which is enveloped. Difference, on the side of difference, it's enveloping because, again, I think of this as kind of active. It's relational. Right? There's a sense in which difference is the driving force. I said it before with implicating, right? That driving force that stimulates anything, the emergence of anything out of this picture. It's the genesis of movement. But again, to kind of complicate things, Deleuze says that difference is also enveloped, ed. It's also enveloped because, again, it's in itself. It is what it is in itself. Well, it isn't what it is, actually. It's difference, but it's this difference in itself. It's the intensity that it is, without kind of reference to anything else. It's that metaphysical bedrock. I think that's the best way I can explain that. And then distance, on the other side, is enveloped, ed. It's enveloped, not enveloping, because, or in the sense that it's this, what I described in the last video, as holding or gathering together. Gathering together based in difference, again with a view to being explicated in quality and extensity. And so, enveloped and implicated, the secondary order of implicated, are basically synonyms here. So it's kind of difficult to explain, actually, like this. I really should have made a diagram. I didn't think about that. But if I can summarize this briefly. So this last characteristic then, intensity, is an implicated and enveloped quantity. So within intensity there are two aspects, difference and distance. Difference is both, difference is implicated and implicating, and it's enveloped and enveloping. But the stress, I think, for Deleuze is on difference being implicated in itself and enveloping, in the sense that it has that active genesis feel to it. But the distance half of that picture, distance is implicated and it's enveloped, and that's because it's basically difference, but moving towards explication, moving towards actualization as a concrete reality. So we get this interesting consequence of this, that intensive quantity as difference and distance, those two orders of implication, and the enveloped distinction, is neither divisible like extensive quantity, nor indivisible like quality. For example, temperature, which isn't made up of other temperatures, rather it's already difference because it's quality. So it's neither divisible like extensive quantity nor indivisible like quality. And this is the quote: "An intensive quantity may be divided, but not without changing its nature. In a sense, it is therefore indivisible, but only because no part exists prior to the division and no part retains the same nature after division." And this is exactly what Bergson's said about wholes as opposed to parts that make them up. an intensive quantity can be divided, but if you do so, it becomes something different. And in that sense, it's indivisible. An intensive quantity is indivisible because no part exists prior to the division, and no part retains the same nature after the division. It's to divide an intensive quantity is to be left with two different things, which are not the same as the original intensive quantity you started with. Again, Bergson talks about this with regards to Zeno and his paradoxes, the way that dividing up the whatever it was, the distance that the arrow has to travel or the distance that the runner has to run. I forget the details actually, but when you divide those, you're left with two wholes, not two parts that make up a whole. And so it was the same kind of picture there. And we said something very similar earlier in this video about ordinal and cardinal numbers. Right? If you cancel the difference that makes up ordinal numbers what they are, that makes an ordinal number what it is, you're not left with an ordinal number that has no difference anymore, that is what it is, that is identical to itself, that is sameness. Instead, you're left with a cardinal number, something fundamentally different, a difference in kind. So the same kind of, that same idea occurs in different guises. And I think that's something which is true of all of Deleuze's work. These same ideas pop up in different places, in different ways. But again, they all contribute to a fuller understanding of the picture. And that leaves me just with this kind of summary quote, which I think wraps up these three characteristics of intensive quantity. In this sense, difference in depth is composed of distances. Distance being not an extensive quantity, but an indivisible asymmetrical relation, ordinal and intensive in character, which is established between series of heterogeneous terms and expresses at each moment the nature of that which does not divide without changing its nature. And can't say it better than that. I think that's a great summary of this. And there's our asymmetrical relation coming back in, which ties into the heading of this chapter. In an indivisible asymmetrical relation, which is what produces, what grounds the sensible, the extensive. And that kind of makes sense of that somewhat cryptic chapter heading, I think. Okay, so the second part of the video then is Bergson's critique of intensity. So when Bergson critiques intensity, he's actually denying the notion of intensive quantity. That for him is a contradiction in terms. And this comes about because of the way he understands intensity. So intensity in duration, or which is it's kind of the same thing as psychic states, is qualitative. Intensity is fundamentally qualitative, not quantitative, meaning that differences in our sensed experiences, our felt experiences, are differences in kind, not degree. And we go astray, or science goes astray, when it tries to convert those, what are fundamentally felt, lived experiences, into measurable, quantifiable terms. That's his critique. But it's a very different critique from the one it's a very different way of analysing this problem than the one that Deleuze takes. So what Deleuze says about Bergson's denial of intensive quantity is that Bergson assumes qualities ready-made and extensities already constituted. But with Deleuze, what he's trying to do is explain both of these, both quality, which he acknowledges are differences in kind, and extension, which are differences in degree. And this explanation is intensity or difference. The problem with this I don't see this as a good critique of Bergson, because they are using their systems. I use the word system, whether you think Deleuze has a system or not. But their philosophical, I won't use the word system, their philosophical frameworks are so different that to criticize one in terms of the other is just completely misguided, I think. And, the way that they use these words then, because their frameworks are so different, the way they use the words, intensity in particular, and quality, are also different. So for one to criticize the way that the other understands a particular term, but criticizing that term within their framework, not in the original framework that it was explicated within, is, I think, kind of disingenuous, to be honest. So for intensity, for example, for Deleuze, is connected with difference in itself. And that has nothing to do with anything that Bergson talks about. For Bergson, intensity is connected with felt experience, lived sensation. And it's not that he's wrong to say that. He's just understanding the word in a different way. Perhaps Deleuze is right. I think that there is an underlying difference which we can track back to understand those lived experiences. But there's no way to say that intensity in Bergson is wrong. It's just the words being used in a different way. It's not being connected with difference in itself, the way that it is in Deleuze. But again, it's not wrong. It's just a different framework. And it's the same with quality. Quality for Deleuze is explicated along with extensity. But for Bergson, quality has nothing to do with the extensive. That would be to turn it into something spatial. And again, Deleuze says basically the same thing. It's not spatial. Quality is not spatial. But it is on that side of the picture, because he has this distinction between difference or intensity and extensity, the implicated and the explicated. And that difference is not in Bergson. Bergson's not thinking in those terms. So at best, I think you could say that Deleuze is an extension of Bergson, perhaps. But this idea of a critique, this idea that Bergson was wrong about intensive quantity, just doesn't make sense, because they're both using these words in completely different ways. So yeah, not 100% sold on this criticism that Deleuze launches. It's just the way that two different. I've talked about this before, actually, but in regard to those levels, phenomenology, actually just phenomenology and metaphysics. A criticism of phenomenology in metaphysical terms just doesn't make sense. And a criticism of metaphysics in phenomenological terms equally doesn't make sense. But you see this happening. Anybody who ever criticizes Husserl is almost always criticizing him from an empirical standpoint or from a metaphysical standpoint, which completely misses the point. And it means that the criticism doesn't land at all, because talking about completely different ways of understanding reality, understanding the world. And it's the same thing here. Deleuze and Bergson have completely different approach, well, not completely different, but in particular with these words, intensity and quantity, they have very different, these words have very different roles in their respective philosophies, and it's almost impossible, well, it's meaningless, I would say, to criticize one in terms of the other. Yeah. So anyway, take from there what you will. The final thing I want to finish on is this question that Deleuze raises. He asks, is there a difference in degree or kind between differences in degree and kind? And you might at first think this is like pure sophistry, right? It's just words now, it's just terms, it's just concepts, and we're devolving into exactly what Deleuze said he hates, this kind of play with concepts. But it is kind of interesting, and there is, I think, something of value to be taken from it. Is there a difference in degree or kind between differences in degree and kind? And the answer is neither. And this is quite enlightening, I think. Difference is a matter of degree only within the extensity in which it is explicated. It's a matter of kind only with regard to the quality which covers it within that extensity. So this is very helpful because we have this distinction between extensity and quality, between qualitas and quale, and one is a difference in degree, extensity, primary qualities, and the other is a difference in kind, quality, quale, the sensation, secondary qualities. And it makes no sense to try and to ask whether the difference between these two things is itself a difference in degree or kind, because differences in degree and kind only apply to those separate explications, to those separate areas of explication. And it works so well within Deleuze's framework here, this notion of difference and intensity and implication, and then extensity and explication, and the way that the intensity is explicated in two areas, extensity and quality. Everything, all of the pieces just fit together so nicely. That's a real it's a real feature of Deleuze, I think, it's a really attractive quality to his philosophy here. So we have reached our summary. So first we talked about intensity or intensive quantity, and basically there are three characteristics. The first is intensity is difference in quantity. So we talked about this as the quality of quantity rather than intensity being quantity as such. It's the quality that belongs to every quantity as difference. And our example here was ordinal numbers and cardinal numbers, and the way that ordinal numbers are intensive and vectorial, and cardinal numbers extensive and scalar, and the way in particular that ordinal numbers are originary because they are grounded in difference. Difference is intrinsic to them. Cardinal numbers are a derivative of those. The second characteristic is that intensity affirms difference, and the affirm here was important because it set up the distinction between affirmation and negation. So this intensity is not a negation. We're not negating difference, rather we are affirming difference at this core metaphysical or transcendental level. The third characteristic, intensity is an implicated and enveloped quantity. So it was implicated as difference, but in that primary order, and implicated as distance in a secondary order. And it's enveloping as difference, but enveloped as distance. And so difference and distance, they're both being a part of intensity. Within intensity, those two aspects play out. Then we looked at Bergson's critique of intensity. And in Deleuze, the idea is that intensity explains both quality and quantity. And it therefore makes sense to talk about intensive quantity because we're looking at difference in itself and those relations that exist between elements. But I question the validity of this as a critique of Deleuze's critique of Bergson, because the philosophical systems that both are dealing with, and therefore the terms, the way that they are using these terms, particularly intensity and quality, are completely different. And finally, this sophistical sounding question, is there a difference in kind or degree between differences in kind and degree? And the answer is neither. And the reason is that difference is a matter of degree within extensity and a matter of kind with regard to quality. So it makes no sense to talk about there being a difference of kind or degree between these two differences. To talk of difference in kind or degree only makes sense within those two aspects of explication. Explicated intensity. And that's us for today. So I'm going to sign off there. Hopefully that helped. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.